The moon goddess buried her greatest secret inside a girl she hoped would never matter. She chose the weakest bloodline. She chose the most forgotten family. She chose a girl with no wolf, no scent, and no future. And then she prayed that girl would never find out what she was carrying. She was wrong. Because the night the most powerful Alpha King alive stood in front of 73 witnesses and said those 4 words, "You are nothing to me," he did not reject a weak girl. He woke something that had been sleeping for 1,000 years. Something older than wolves. Something older than the moon itself. And when it opened its eyes inside her bones, the moon goddess flinched. Let me tell you something that nobody in that council chamber understood until it was too late. The girl they pitted was never the victim. The king who rejected her was never in control. And the most powerful elder in the known pack world, a man who spent 40 years building an empire in the shadows, made one mistake. One single, irreversible mistake. He chose her. He chose the hollow girl. He chose the one person in the entire world whose emptiness was not weakness. It was a door. And he walked through it himself and locked it behind him before he understood what was standing on the other side. This is not a story about a rejected girl finding her power. Every story does that. This is the story of what happens when the power was never lost in the first place. When it was only waiting. When it was only learning the face of every person it would eventually have to face. Stay with me. Because the moment the Alpha King kneels, and he does kneel, this king who has never kneeled for anyone in 11 years of ruling, the moment his knee touches that cold obsidian floor in front of the girl he publicly humiliated, you will understand something that will sit with you for a long time. You will understand that the most dangerous person in any room is never the one with the most power. It is the one who was told they had none, and believed it just long enough to let everyone around them get comfortable. Do not skip this story. Because the twist is not at the end. The twist was in the very first sentence. And by the time you understand what it was, you will have to start from the beginning again. The bones in her wrists snapped before she hit the ground. She heard them break. 2 clean cracks like greenwood splitting in winter. And the sound echoed off the stone walls of the Alpha King's great hall before anyone else reacted. The crowd of wolves went silent. 73 pack representatives, elder wolves with silver threading their temples, warriors who had bathed in the blood of rival packs, and not one of them made a sound. They only stared at the girl on the floor. Her name was Marin Ashvale, and she was 18 years old, and she was bleeding onto the polished obsidian tiles, and she did not cry. That was the first thing that unsettled them. She pressed her broken wrist against her chest, and she raised her head, and she looked directly at the Alpha King on his throne. He smelled like cedar smoke and cold iron, like something ancient that had forgotten how to be warm. His name was Selim Voss, and he was the most powerful wolf alive, and he had just rejected her in front of every leader in the known pack world. "You are nothing," he had said, and his voice had carried no cruelty, which was somehow worse than if it had. "You carry no wolf. You carry no scent. You are a hollow girl, and I will not have a hollow girl as my mate." The rejection bond had torn through her chest like a fishhook pulled backward through soft tissue. She had felt her knees give out. She had felt the floor rise to meet her, and her wrist had hit the stone edge of the dais, and now she was here, kneeling, bleeding, broken, and she was looking at him with eyes the color of storm water, and she was smiling. Not a small smile. Not a polite, endure-the-pain smile. A wide, slow, knowing smile, like someone who has just heard the punchline of a joke that will not be funny to anyone else for a very long time. Selim Voss felt something move in his chest that he did not have a name for. "Remove her," he said. 2 of his royal guard stepped forward. Enormous wolves, 8 feet of shifted muscle and territorial rage. And when the first one touched Marin's shoulder, she turned her head and looked at him. He stopped moving. He stood completely still, and his hand remained on her shoulder, and his eyes went blank, and the hall watched him stand there like a man who had been turned to salt. "Doran," Selim said sharply. The guard did not respond. His second guard reached for Marin instead. The same thing happened. Contact. Stillness. Eyes like windows with the lights extinguished. The cedar and iron smell of the Alpha King's composure began to fray at its edges. He descended from his throne, 7 steps carved from black volcanic rock, each one worn smooth by 300 years of kings walking them, and he crossed the hall floor, and he crouched in front of the broken girl, and he studied her face. She smelled like nothing. That was what had damned her in the first place. Every wolf in this hall carried a scent signature: pine, resin and musk, salt and copper, the warm animal sweetness of a living wolf's soul nested inside human skin. Marin smelled like rain on dry stone, like a room where something used to be. "What did you do to my men?" Selim asked quietly. "I did not do anything," Marin said, and her voice was steady in a way that made the hair on the back of his neck lift. "They are simply remembering." "Remembering what?" Her stormwater eyes moved across his face with the slow, deliberate attention of someone reading a document they have read many times before. "The moment before they were born," she said. "The place they came from. The dark that existed before the moon goddess put light in it." The temperature in the hall dropped. Not metaphorically. Condensation formed on the stone walls, a fine silver breath of cold that had no natural source, and the candle flames in their iron sconces bent sideways all at once, leaning away from the girl on the floor as though even fire understood the instinct to retreat. Elder Sova, the oldest wolf in the hall at 219 years, made a sound that none of the younger wolves had ever heard from her. It was fear. Raw, animal, foundational fear, the kind that lives below thought, below memory, in the part of the brain that exists only to say, "Run." Selim did not run. He was the Alpha King. He had defeated 11 challengers. He had held a silver blade in his bare hands for 6 seconds during the rite of ascension, long enough to prove his dominance, short enough not to die, barely. He did not run from an 18-year-old girl with a broken wrist and no wolf soul. "You have no wolf," he said, and it was not an accusation this time. It was a question wearing an accusation's clothing. Marin tilted her head. The smile had not left her face. "I do not have a wolf," she agreed. "I have what wolves dream about when they are most afraid." She opened her broken hand. The wrist was shattered. He could see the swelling already darkening beneath her skin, the deep arterial purple of serious damage. And she opened it anyway, palm up, and inside her palm there was nothing. An absence. A shape the size of a heartbeat, perfectly dark, radiating a cold so deep it had a texture, like breathing in winter air that has never once been breathed before. The 2 frozen guards dropped simultaneously, gasping, clutching their own chests as sensation returned to them, and both of them scrambled backward across the floor away from Marin on their hands and knees, which no royal guard had ever done in the history of the kingdom. Selim stared at the dark in her hand. "The moon goddess made wolves," Marin said softly, and her voice had taken on a resonance that did not belong entirely to her, as though something deeper was lending her its vocal cords. She spun moonlight into soul and pressed it into flesh and called it her greatest creation. But she made something else first. The dark in her palm pulsed once, like a second heartbeat. She made the space between stars. She made the silence before the first howl. She made the dark that the moon cuts through. And then she was afraid of what she had made, because it was older than she was, and deeper than she was, and it did not need her the way her wolves needed her. So she hid it. The cold intensified, and Selim felt it move through his chest, reaching past muscle and sternum and into the chamber of his wolf soul, touching it with one black finger, and his wolf, his ancient, battle-hardened, never once submitted wolf, went perfectly, completely still, like prey. His wolf had never been prey. She hid it in a bloodline she thought would die out, Marin continued, and the resonance in her voice was so deep now that the stone floor was vibrating beneath them both. She chose a family with no status, no territory, no alpha blood. She chose a line of hollow girls, wolf-less and scentless and safe to ignore. She chose my grandmother's grandmother's grandmother, and she buried her oldest, darkest creation inside that woman's bones and prayed it would sleep forever. The dark in Marin's palm expanded, just slightly, and the nearest candelabra went out entirely, and the section of the hall it had illuminated became a darkness so complete it seemed to have dimension, to have weight. It did not sleep forever, Marin said. Selim realized he was still crouching in front of her. He realized he had not stood up. He realized, with a clarity that arrived like cold water to the face, that he was not crouching because he was choosing to remain at her level. He was crouching because something in him understood that standing would be the wrong thing to do. That standing in this moment in front of this girl would be the same thing as a spark introducing itself to a wildfire. "You came here," he said carefully, and his voice had lost its king's certainty and found something more honest. "To be my mate." "I came here," Marin corrected gently, "because the bond brought me here. But I knew what you would do." Her storm-water eyes held his without blinking. "I knew you would reject me. And I knew what the rejection would do." The full understanding moved through him slowly, the way cold moves through water, finding every channel. The rejection of a fated mate required both parties to channel enormous spiritual force, the alpha giving the refusal, the rejected receiving it. It was an act of profound metaphysical violence. Most rejected omegas survived it by going numb, by letting the bond's severance hollow them out, by becoming smaller. But Marin had nothing to hollow out. She had no wolf to sever. She had only this ancient, sleeping, impossible thing coiled inside her bones, and when the rejection had hit her, when his refusal had torn through the space where a wolf's soul should have been, it had not found emptiness. It had found the dark between stars. And it had woken it up. "You used me," Selim said. He should have been furious. He was not furious. He was something he had not been since he was 7 years old, and his father had taken him to the edge of the territory at midnight and told him to listen to the forest. He was awestruck. "I used the bond," Marin said. "The same way you used my humiliation for political theater." She closed her hand, and the darkness in her palm compressed and disappeared, and the candles relit themselves one by one, and the guards along the walls slowly remembered how to breathe. "We are even," she said. She stood. She stood with a broken wrist and a severed mate bond and the weight of something older than the moon goddess living in her skeleton, and she stood the way mountains stand, without effort, without performance, simply because that is what they do. Selim rose with her. The hall watched its king rise in the presence of a wolf-less girl, and no one spoke, because all 73 of them had felt it, the touch of that cold finger against their own wolf souls, brief and gentle and absolute. Reminder. Demonstration. A declaration that had no need to raise its voice. "What do you want?" Selim asked, and the question contained no threat and no pride and nothing political. It was the most honest question he had asked in 11 years of kingship. Marin looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the moon, full and silver and suddenly strange, suddenly watchful, moved behind a cloud as though hiding its face. "I want," Marin said quietly, "what the moon goddess took from my bloodline. I want recognition. I want a seat at every table where wolf law is made. And I want every hollow girl in every pack who was called nothing and sent away and left to rot in rejection. I want them brought back." The hall was silent. Selim felt his wolf stir inside him, cautious and careful, testing the air the way a wolf tests ice before crossing water. And then, for the first time in 3 centuries of kingship lineage, the alpha king of all packs lowered himself to one knee in front of someone who was not a king. "I rejected my mate," he said, and his voice carried the full weight of the hall, every ear sharp and every eye wide. "And in doing so, I woke something that was sleeping. That is on me." He met her eyes. "Tell me how to fix it." Above the great hall behind the clouds, the moon goddess pressed her hands together and felt, for the first time since she had buried her oldest creation in a dying bloodline and told herself it would stay buried. She felt the cold certainty of being wrong. She felt the ancient dark look up at her through a pair of stormwater eyes. And she understood at last what fear was. The kneeling lasted exactly 4 seconds. Selim Voss, Alpha King of all packs, rose from his single knee with the controlled precision of a man who understood that every movement he made in this hall was being catalogued, analyzed, and would be retold in every territory within 1,000 miles before the next moon rose. He rose and he straightened his spine, and he looked at Marin Ashvale with eyes that had shifted, just barely, just at the edges, from their human gray to the deep amber of his wolf. His wolf was paying attention now. Had no choice. "Council is dismissed," Selim said, and his voice carried the tone that was not a request and was not a suggestion and was not a question. It was the voice of a man who had learned at 7 years old that volume is the weapon of the weak, and that true authority lives in the stillness beneath sound. No one moved. This was unusual. In 11 years of ruling, no one had ever not moved when Selim Voss dismissed a room. He let the silence sit for 3 full seconds, the way a knife sits on a table. Present, patient, inevitably dangerous. "Now," he added, and the word was so quiet that the wolves nearest to him had to strain to hear it. And that quietness was somehow the most frightening version of the word that had ever been spoken in the great hall of the Alpha King. They moved. All 73 of them, scraping chairs and gathering robes and avoiding eye contact with both the king and the girl, filing out through the great arched doorways with the focused urgency of people pretending they were not fleeing. The doors closed. The boom of them echoed off the obsidian floors and died in the high rafters, where the mounted skulls of 7 rival alphas, tradition brutal and clear, stared down at the empty hall. Marin stood in the center of the floor. Her broken wrist was held against her chest, the swelling now significant and deeply colored, and she had not asked for anything to be done about it, and the fact that she had not asked told Selim more about her life than anything she had spoken aloud. People who grew up valued ask for help when they are injured. People who grew up as nothing learned to inventory their damage privately and manage it alone. He turned to the small door behind the throne, the private passage that led to the king's working chambers, and he gestured without looking at her. "Come," he said. Not a command, he added, which was something he had never in his life said after giving direction to anyone. The addition surprised him as much as it likely surprised her. He heard her footsteps follow him, and they were even and unhurried, and she did not limp despite what the fall had done to her, which meant either the pain threshold she carried was extraordinary or she had learned to perform steadiness so completely that her body had stopped knowing the difference. He suspected both. The king's private study smelled of beeswax candles, old leather, and the faint mineral bite of the ink he used for pack correspondence. 3 of the walls were lined floor to ceiling with law texts, territorial records, and histories so old the vellum had gone translucent at the edges. The 4th wall was glass, an entire floor-to-ceiling expanse looking out over the mountain range that bordered the king's territory, the peaks sharp and silver in the moonlight, the forest below them a dark breathing mass that extended to the horizon and beyond. Marin stopped at the glass wall and looked out. Selim watched her look. He had stood at that glass wall 10,000 times and looked at those mountains, and he had always seen his kingdom. The breadth of it, the weight of it, the responsibility of managing what lived in that dark forest below. He wondered, watching her, what she saw. He suspected it was something different. He suspected she saw the spaces between the peaks, the dark that the moonlight did not reach, the parts of the mountain that existed without needing to be witnessed. He moved to the side table and poured water into a shallow basin and brought it to her without being asked, along with a strip of linen from the emergency kit his healer had insisted on placing in every room of the palace 3 years ago after he had refused to stop working through injuries. "Your wrist," he said. She looked at the basin and then at him, and something moved across her face that was gone before he could name it. She sat in the chair nearest the glass wall, and she set her wrist in the basin, and the cold water turned faintly pink, and she began wrapping the linen without asking for assistance. He sat across from her. The silence between them was not the silence of two people who had nothing to say. It was the silence of two people with so much to say that choosing the first sentence felt like choosing which thread to pull from a knot. The wrong choice and everything tightens further. "How long," Selim said finally, "have you known what you carry?" Marin's hands continued their careful, competent work on the linen wrapping. "My mother told me the night before she died," she said. "She had kept it from me for 18 years because she was afraid that knowing would change me." "She was right," Marin said without particular emotion. "It did change me." "How did she die?" The question left his mouth before he had decided to ask it, which was also unusual. Selim Voss was not an impulsive man. He did not ask questions before deciding to ask them. He was beginning to understand that Marin Ashvale disrupted things simply by existing in proximity to them. "She was killed," Marin said. Simple. Flat. Final. "By whom?" She tied off the linen and looked at her wrapped wrist for a moment, checking the tension with clinical detachment. Then she looked up at him. "By someone who was also watching tonight," she said. The temperature in the study did not change. But Selim's wolf went very still inside him, in the specific way it went still when it was identifying a threat, not the cold stillness of the dark thing in Marin's bones, but the hot, focused stillness of a predator recognizing that another predator had entered its territory without permission. "Who?" he said, and it was not a question. "Elder Cassin," Marin said. "Second chair of the Eastern Council." He stood near the back left pillar during the proceedings. Gray robe, gold chain, scar beneath his left eye from a challenge fight he won in the year I was born. Selim sat very still. Elder Cassin was 70 years old and had served on the Eastern Council for 4 decades and was considered, by everyone in the political architecture of pack law, to be a moderate voice, a careful diplomat, a wolf who valued stability above all things. He was also, Selim now recalled, the wolf who had personally recommended Marin Ashvale's name to the mate selection committee 6 months ago. He had said she was a strong candidate. He had said she came from a bloodline with interesting history. He had used the word interesting in a way that had seemed, at the time, like the bland enthusiasm of an old wolf with too much time for genealogical research. Selim understood now that the word interesting had been a blade disguised as a pleasantry. "He sent you here," Selim said. "He did not send me," Marin said carefully. "He arranged for me to be found. He arranged for the bond to be triggered. He arranged for me to be standing in front of the one alpha king powerful enough to produce a rejection strong enough to wake what I carry." He paused. "He did not expect me to know that is what he was doing. He expected me to be a weapon that did not know it was a weapon." Outside the glass wall, the forest moved in a wind that Selim could not hear through the thick panes, the trees bending and straightening in dark waves, a million pine needles catching the moonlight and releasing it. What does he want with what you carry? Selim asked. What does anyone want with the oldest darkness that exists? Marin replied. He wants to use it. He has spent 40 years building a political coalition that is 3 votes away from challenging your kingship through the council. He does not want to wait for 3 more votes. He wants something that makes votes irrelevant. Selim absorbed this. He was not a man who panicked. Panic was a luxury that kings could not afford, because panic was contagious, and a contagious king was a dead king. But beneath his composure, in the chamber where his wolf lived, something cold and furious was beginning to pace. If he wanted a weapon, Selim said slowly, why send you here to be rejected publicly? Because a public rejection was necessary. Marin's stormwater eyes were steady and patient, the eyes of someone who had rehearsed this explanation in the dark for a long time. The dark I carry responds to profound spiritual violence, she said. A private rejection would not have been enough. He needed it witnessed. He needed the metaphysical weight of 73 witnesses, 73 wolf souls adding their shock and their pity and their contempt to the moment of severance. That kind of collective spiritual event is like, she paused, searching for language. Like striking a match inside a room that has been filling with gas for 18 years. The fire analogy was not lost on him. And now it is awake, Selim said. Now it is awake, she confirmed. And he will come for you, Selim said. He will come for me, she agreed. Tonight, Selim said. Something shifted in her expression. It was subtle. A fractional tightening at the corners of her eyes, a brief compression of her lips. But Selim had spent 11 years reading the micro-expressions of wolves who were trying to hide things from him, and he read it clearly. It was not surprise. It was confirmation of something she had already calculated. Yes, she said. Tonight. He posted 12 of his royal guard around the perimeter of the guest wing where he placed her. And he told them that the girl was under King's protection, which was a legal designation that carried the weight of pack law and the penalty of death for violation, and he told them nothing else. The guard captain, a woman named Yold with close-cropped silver hair and 20 years of service and eyes that asked no questions that were not strictly tactical, posted her people with the quiet efficiency of someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that kings developed complicated situations, and the guard's job was to manage the perimeter of those situations, not to understand them. Selim returned to his study. He did not sleep. He stood at the glass wall and looked at the mountains and thought about Elder Casson standing near the back left pillar in a gray robe with a gold chain, watching the rejection with the patient satisfaction of a man watching a machine he had built perform its function. He thought about Marin's mother. He thought about a woman who had kept a world-altering secret for 18 years to protect her daughter from knowing she was different, and he thought about how that protection had also been a deprivation. How Marin had grown up wolfless in pack society, which was roughly equivalent to growing up boneless in a world that valued only what was structural. He thought about what that did to a person. He thought about the smile she had worn on the floor of the great hall with a broken wrist and a severed mate bond and 73 wolves staring at her. He understood that smile differently now. It was not the smile of someone who had found the situation amusing. It was the smile of someone who had rehearsed for precisely this moment for a very long time, who had studied every angle of the trap set for her and found within the trap a secondary door that no one else had noticed. She had let them wake the dark. But she had chosen, specifically chosen, to wake it in front of the one wolf in the world with both the authority and the practical need to hear what it meant. She had turned Elder Casson's weapon into a petition. The sophistication of it made the back of his teeth ache. The attack came at the second hour past midnight. It did not come from outside. It came from inside, which meant Elder Casson had people embedded in the palace, which meant this had been planned with a depth and patience that made Selim's blood run cold in a way that had nothing to do with ancient darkness and everything to do with the specific, clarifying cold of political betrayal. He heard the first guard go down. Not a death, he would learn later, but a sedation, a wolfsbane compound delivered through a dart so fine it left a mark smaller than a needle's eye. He was moving before the second sound reached him, through the private passage, through the corridor, through the east wing with his wolf rising to the surface of his skin. Not a full shift, not in the palace but the half-state, the in-between that let him move at wolf speed in a human hallway. He reached the guest wing and found Yold standing in the corridor outside Marin's door with 3 darts in her left arm and still standing through sheer refusal. Her hand pressed flat against the door she was guarding. Her silver eyes burning with the particular fury of a wolf who is being chemically prevented from doing her job. "Inside," Yold managed, and her voice was thick and slurring at the edges. "2 of them inside." "How?" Selim said, because the door was bolted from the outside and the windows in the guest wing did not open, which was a security feature. "Passage," Yold said. "Behind the east wall." He had not known about a passage behind the east wall of the guest wing, which meant someone had built it without his knowledge, or without the knowledge of any king before him who had not been suspicious of the east. Selim looked at the 2 unconscious wolves on the floor of the guest room, and he thought about Elder Cassin in his grey robe watching everything with the patient eyes of a man who had been building toward this moment for 40 years. He thought about 3 votes. He thought about 40 years of coalition building, of careful alliances and quiet agreements, and the slow assembly of political power that was, by every metric available to him, almost sufficient to challenge a king. Almost. He looked at Marin. "He does not know," Selim said slowly, working through it as he spoke, "what exactly you can do." "He knows the darkness woke," she said. "He knows it is in me. He does not know what I have learned to do with it." "In the 6 months since your mother died," Selim said. "In the 6 months since my mother told me," Marin corrected quietly. The distinction was important and she knew he would understand why. Her mother had not simply died. Her mother had told her everything. And then her mother had been killed by someone who had learned that the telling had happened. Cassin had 6 months ago. He had spent those 6 months engineering tonight. And Marin had spent those 6 months doing something else with the time. "What have you learned to do with it?" Selim asked. Outside the glass, the moon was still half hidden behind its cloud, and the mountains were dark and sharp and immovable, and the forest below breathed in the wind. Marin was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the floor, then at her wrapped wrist, then at the unconscious wolf against the cracked wall, then at Selim. "I can find things that are hidden," she said. "Things that exist in the dark between what is said and what is true. Things that people have buried and prayed would stay buried." She let that sit in the air between them. "Elder Cassin," she said, "has 40 years of buried things." The understanding arrived in Selim the way the cold had arrived earlier, finding every channel, filling every space. She was not simply a weapon. She was not simply a bomb that Cassin had built and she had redirected. She was something the moon goddess had never intended to be used for pack politics, for council chambers, for the grinding machinery of territorial law. And yet here she was, wolf-less, broken-wrist, 18 years old, offering to pull 40 years of buried secrets out of the dark where Elder Cassin had placed them. "If I accept your help," Selim said carefully, "I am acknowledging a debt." "You already owe me a debt," Marin said without heat, without accusation. "You rejected your mate in front of 73 witnesses for political optics." "I know," he said. It was the second honest thing he had said tonight. The first had been asking how to fix it. He was beginning to think that honesty in the presence of this girl, was not a choice so much as an inevitability, that the dark she carried had some peripheral effect on performance and pretense, burning it away the way light burns away shadow, or perhaps more accurately, the way the deepest dark burns away the shallow dark, leaving only what is genuinely, structurally true. "What do you need?" he said. Maren stood from the edge of the bed. She was not tall. She was, in fact, considerably shorter than him, shorter than most of the wolves in the hall tonight, which had made her smallness on the floor during the rejection even more visually stark. But she stood in a way that made the question of physical height feel irrelevant, the way the depth of the ocean is irrelevant to questions of its surface measurement. "I need access to Cassin's private chambers before the morning session," she said. "I need 1 hour alone in a room where he has kept things. And I need your word. Not a king's word, not a political word, but your actual word, that what I find will be acted on. That it will not be managed and minimized and buried again in the interest of council stability." Selim looked at her for a long moment. His wolf, which had been hot and focused during the fight, was settling now into something he had not felt from it in a very long time. It was not submission. It was recognition. The specific, bone-deep recognition of one predator acknowledging another predator as something other than prey or rival. Something closer to equal. Something that, in a different world, might have been called partner. He held out his hand. Not to shake. Alphas did not shake hands. It was not the gesture of their world. He held it palm up, open, the way a wolf shows it is not holding a weapon. "You have my word," he said. "Not a king's word." Maren looked at his open hand. She placed her uninjured hand in it, palm down, and the contact was brief and formal, and somehow heavier than anything that had happened in the great hall tonight. "Then we have until morning," she said. Outside, behind its cloud, the moon goddess pressed her palms together and felt the distinct, vertiginous sensation of events moving in a direction she had not written, had not planned, had not considered possible in the 3,000 years she had been writing the fates of wolves. The dark had been a mistake. She had known that since the moment she made it. But this girl, this king, this alliance forming in a cracked guest room over a broken wrist and 40 years of buried secrets. This was not a mistake. This was something entirely new. And the moon goddess, who was very old and had thought herself done with surprises, pressed her palms together in the dark above the mountains and felt something she had not felt since before she made the first wolf. She felt the future refused to be written. She felt it look back at her. She felt it smile. The council chamber smelled of fear before anyone entered it. Maren noticed it first. She noticed it the way she noticed everything now. Not through the 5 senses that wolves relied on, the sharp animal catalogue of scent and sound and the electric awareness of pack bonds humming beneath the skin, but through the 6th thing, the older thing, the sense that had no name because it had existed before language had been invented to name it. The fear in the chamber was not fresh. It was old fear, ground into the stone over decades, the accumulated residue of every wolf who had stood in this room and understood that the words spoken here could end territories, end bloodlines, end lives with no weapon raised and no blood spilled. Political fear. The most durable kind. Maren walked through it like she was walking through water. Elder Cassin's chambers had given her everything she needed. 1 hour alone in a room where he had kept things. A carved wooden box beneath the floorboards, wrapped in treated leather that blocked wolf scent, containing 37 years of correspondence so careful and so damning that reading it felt like watching a man build a gallows one careful plank at a time. She had not needed to read it with her eyes. She had pressed her uninjured palm flat against the floorboards above the box and let the dark do what the dark does in the deep places of the world. It had found the buried thing. It had read it the way deep water reads the shape of the ground beneath it, and it had given her everything. Packs that had been destabilized deliberately. Alphas who had died in challenge fights that Cassin had quietly engineered by ensuring their challengers were funded, trained, and strategically timed. A sitting council elder who had been removed from her position 11 years ago through fabricated evidence of treaty violation. Evidence that Casson had constructed himself over 18 quiet months. And one name that had made Marin's hand go still against the floorboards and her breath stop in her chest for a full 4 seconds. Her mother's name. Written in Casson's hand. In a letter dated 6 months and 3 days ago. 4 days before her mother had been killed. The letter was to someone Marin did not recognize, a name she had never heard, but the instruction was clear and brief and written in the clipped shorthand of a man who had given this kind of instruction before and expected it to be understood without elaboration. The hollow girl's mother knows, the letter had said. She will tell the girl. See to it that she tells no one else. Marin had knelt on the floor of Elder Casson's chambers for a long time after that. She had knelt in the dark with her broken wrist and her mother's name written in old ink, and she had felt the thing inside her bones stir with a heat she had not felt from it before. The dark was not, she had thought it was cold. It was old. There was a difference. Old things could burn. She had stood, and she had walked back through the palace corridors to where Selim was waiting at the end of the passage, and she had told him what she had found, and she had watched his face do the thing faces do when political understanding and genuine moral outrage arrive in the same moment and cannot be separated. He had been silent for a long time. Then he had said, "In the morning." And she had said, "In the morning." The council chamber held 90 wolves when it was full. 73 representatives, 6 royal guard at the perimeter, the king's 3 legal advisers at the document table, the council clerk at her station, the 2 honorary witnesses required by pack law for any session where kingship matters were on the agenda, and today, for the first time in the recorded history of the chamber, 1 additional person who held none of these titles and had not been assigned any of these roles. Marin Ashvale stood at the left of the king's table. Not behind him. Not at a respectful distance indicating her lower status. At his left hand, where a partner stood, where an equal stood, where someone the king had decided to place his trust stood in the full architectural statement of physical positioning that wolves read as instinctively as breathing. The chamber noticed. The chamber did not know what to do with what it noticed. Elder Casson sat in his chair at the Eastern delegation table and looked at Marin with eyes that were perfectly composed and utterly cold, and she looked back at him, and she felt nothing from him. No remorse, no fear, not yet. Only the settled certainty of a man who had not yet understood that the machine he built had been fully disassembled in the night. Selim did not sit. He stood at the king's table with both hands resting flat on the surface, and he looked at the room, and the room looked back at him, and the session had not technically begun but the energy of it was already compressed and electric, the way air feels in the seconds before lightning touches ground. "Before formal proceedings open," Selim said, "I am invoking King's right of direct address." This produced a murmur. King's right of direct address was a provision that allowed the reigning Alpha King to speak to the full council without procedural interruption for as long as he deemed necessary. It had been invoked twice in 300 years. Both previous invocations had preceded wars. "Last night," Selim said, 2 wolves in dark clothing entered the palace through a passage built without my knowledge in the eastern guest wing wall. They entered the room of a person under King's protection. They were dispatched by my hand. They are currently in the holding cells beneath the North Tower, and they will be identified and tried under pack law. The murmur in the room became textured, directional, the way wind becomes directional when it finds a channel. Several pairs of eyes moved to Elder Casson. Casson's face remained composed. His hands, Marin noticed, had flattened against the table in front of him, the palms pressing down. The unconscious gesture of a man trying to keep something from rising. "I am also invoking," Selim continued, "the King's right of evidence presentation, under Article 7 of the Founding Pack Accords, which allows any evidence relevant to the safety and stability of the kingship to be entered into formal council record without prior procedural approval. Now the room was not murmuring. The room was still. The particular stillness of 90 wolves who understand that something is about to happen that will be permanently significant, that will divide time into before this moment and after this moment, and who are not sure which side of that division they want to be standing on. Selim looked at Marin. She stepped forward. She had changed her clothing. Selim had arranged it quietly and practically with no ceremony, and she wore deep gray now, the color of the mountains before dawn, and her broken wrist was wrapped in clean white linen that was the only brightness on her, and she carried nothing in her hands. She did not need to carry anything. "My name is Marin Ashvale," she said, and her voice was clear and even and reached every corner of the chamber without effort. "I was brought to this council yesterday as a candidate for the Alpha King's mate bond. I was publicly rejected. I was then sent to be collected in the night by 2 wolves acting on instruction. Before I tell you what I know about who gave that instruction, I want to tell you something about what I am." She looked at the room. All of it. Every face, every pair of eyes. The elders with their silver-threaded dignity, and the young representatives who had never seen anything like this and were not sure what expression to arrange themselves into. "I have no wolf," she said. "You know this. What you do not know is what I have instead." She opened her right hand, her uninjured hand, palm up at her side. The dark appeared. Not dramatically. Not with the compressed cold intensity of the great hall when it had been woken by pain and shock and the weight of 73 witnesses. It appeared quietly, the way dawn appears. Gradually, inevitably, with the patience of something that does not need to announce itself because it was here before the concept of announcement existed. A sphere of absolute dark, the size of a closed fist, hovering above her open palm. No cold this time. This time it was warm. Warmly, deeply, bone-achingly warm in the way that the darkness beneath the earth is warm. Not with fire, not with light, but with the accumulated heat of everything that has ever lived and died and returned to the ground. Several wolves near the front of the room began to cry. They did not know why. They would not be able to explain it afterward. It was the warmth, Marin understood. It was the warmth of the dark reaching into them and finding every person they had ever lost and holding that loss gently, briefly, with the enormous impersonal tenderness of something that has received every dead thing since the beginning of time and kept them somewhere safe. "This is what the moon goddess made before she made wolves," Marin said, and the resonance was in her voice again, the borrowed depth. "This is what she was afraid of. Not because it is evil. Because it is honest. It does not perform. It does not negotiate. It does not build coalitions over 40 years and write careful letters and arrange deaths and fabricate evidence and call itself a moderate voice for stability." She turned and looked directly at Elda Casson. "It only remembers," she said. "And it remembered everything in your chambers last night.